In this video, I'm going to show you how to remove a frozen rear ABS sensor on the 2002 Mustang GT. Now, there are two ways to remove it, the hard way and the easy way. The easy way is to just bust it out. Of course, if you take the easy way out, you're going to have to buy a new ABS sensor. Now, if you're removing a frozen ABS sensor that's defective, it's a no-brainer. Busting it out is the way to go. However, ABS sensors rarely go bad because they're not a part that is subject to wear. Unfortunately, you will have to remove the rear ABS sensor or at least push it back in its bore if you need to remove the rear axle shaft. Because in order to remove the axle C-clip retainer, you have to push the axle in. And the body of the ABS sensor is immediately behind the reluctor wheel, preventing you from doing so. Now, ABS sensors only cost about $25, so you still might want to consider busting it out because it's a hell of a lot faster. The downside to that, beside the expenditure of $25, is that your local auto parts store may not carry the part. Then you'll have to order the part, lose 2 to 5 calendar days, and spend $25 just to save half an hour's labor by busting the sensor out instead of removing it intact. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on how to bust the part out, because breaking things is pretty easy to do. My only advice would be to be careful to relegate the damage to only the part you are replacing. However, if you want to reuse the ABS sensor, I'll show you a method which will allow you to remove a frozen ABS sensor without damage. If you could get a socket against the face of your ABS sensor, there's a good chance you could drive it out without any damage. However, the reluctor wheel is in the way, preventing you from getting a socket or some kind of driver against the face of the sensor. The catch-22 is you'd have to pull the axle to remove the reluctor wheel. But you can't remove the axle unless you remove the ABS sensor, or at the very least, push it back in its bore. One way to do that is to fabricate a spanner bracket that fits between the face of the sensor and the inner face of the reluctor wheel, so you can press the sensor into the bore with 2 C-clamps. Fabricating the bracket is really quick and simple. Even if all you have is a hacksaw to cut the slot, it'll take you less than 2 minutes if you use perforated angle line. You only have about a 3/16 inch gap between the face of the sensor and the inner face of the reluctor wheel. 1¼ by 1¼ by 1/8 thick angle line is ideal, because it's thin enough to fit in the gap, but strong enough to withstand bending. Now I'll go ahead and use this bracket to press the ABS sensor back in its bore and flush with the caliper anchor plate. Alright, now I'm on the passenger side, and this ABS sensor is also frozen in its bore by rust. But this time, instead of busting it out and destroying it, I'm going to press it out with the spanner bracket I fabricated and 2 C-clamps. As you can see, the bracket's already in place, and I've already started to push it back into its bore. I've already moved it about 1/8 of an inch, so this technique is definitely working. So I'll just continue to tighten the clamps evenly until the spanner bracket is flush against the caliper anchor plate. I'll put a little more deep creep on it, and then continue to crank it down evenly. You hear that? The body of the sensor is plastic, so it's important to apply the pressure evenly to avoid cracking it. That thing is tight. You know it's tight in the bore because you have to apply a lot of pressure, and then it moves incrementally and suddenly. It kind of makes the same sound a ball joint makes when you press it out. It's a bit of a slow process, but if you apply too much pressure or apply too quickly, you take a greater risk of cracking the plastic. Alright, I think it's just about there. Now that I've pressed the sensor in as far as I could with the spanner bracket and clamps, I'll remove them and see if I can pull it out the rest of the way with a pair of channel locks. No, I can't even twist it, and I can't really get a good grip on it because of its shape. And because it's plastic, if I squeeze too hard, I risk cracking it. The truth of the matter is, I don't actually have to remove the sensor to remove the axle. The sensor just needs to be pushed back out of the way. Aside from the ABS sensor, the main thing that has to be removed to push the axle shaft back is the pinion pin. Now I can push the axle back, which then reveals the C-clip retainer, and that has to be removed to pull the axle. After you've done all that, you can easily pull the axle shaft out from the axle tube. Okay, now the axle shaft's removed, and as you can see, I installed a bearing puller adapter just to keep any dirt from getting in the axle tube. Now I'll take a socket and extension and use it as a driver, and carefully drive the ABS sensor the rest of the way out. Now I'll just wipe it down with a paper towel so I can check to see if it has any damage or cracks. And it looks good. It appears to be undamaged. It can be reused. Now I should check to see how rusty the bore is. Let me bring the camera closer so you can see it too. And as you can see, it's a bit rusty. Alright, I got some 150 grit sandpaper, just an old sanding disc I had lying around. And I'll roll it up so it fits inside the bore. And I don't want to go too crazy here. I just want to remove the loose rust. Don't need to make the hole bright and shiny. As a matter of fact, if I did, I might make the hole bigger. And that would be bad because it's supposed to be a tight fit. Let's see how it fits. Alright, that's good. Don't need a hammer to drive it in, but there's no play. Now that I'm happy with the fit, I'm going to push it out and leave it out until I'm done replacing the axle bearing and seal and putting the drive shaft back in. Because just like you had to remove the sensor first to remove the axle shaft, you have to install the sensor last to reinstall the axle shaft. I'll just fast forward through the wheel bearing and oil seal replacement and the reinstallation of the axle shaft. If you're interested in a detailed video of this, I'll add a link here when I upload it. Or better yet, if you subscribe, you'll be notified whenever I upload any new videos. Now that the axle shaft is completely reinstalled, I can finally reinstall the sensor. And there's nothing much to it. You just have to put it in a hole and bolt it in. But like anything else, there are some details you should pay attention to. According to the Ford Factory Service Manual, you should apply some anti-seize to the sensor before installing it. Considering how hard it was to remove, it makes you wonder if they did at the factory. But then again, that was well over 20 years ago. It is a tight fit in the bore, so make sure you press it down fully so that the flange bottoms out against the steel. Since it's a single-sided flange, you wouldn't want to draw it in with a bolt. You'd risk cracking it. Once you confirm it's fully seated, you're ready to bolt it in, but not before you add some Loctite to the bolt, because it only gets torqued down to 62 inch-pounds. I'll just run the bolt in by hand, then I'll grab a 1/4 inch torque wrench and set it to 62 inch-pounds. Put a 1/4 inch socket on it and tighten it down until it clicks. Let's see that click again. Okay, 62 inch-pounds. And that's it. This passenger side ABS sensor, which was frozen in its bore, has been removed and reinstalled without damage. Here I am back on the driver's side, and I actually removed this sensor first. But rather than come up with a way to remove it carefully, I just attempted to remove it with brute force and destroyed it in the process. So I had to buy a new ABS sensor. The local auto parts store didn't have it in stock. I had to order it and wait 3 days. And here it is. I got one made by Holstein. On a part like this, the brand's not that critical. Any reputable parts manufacturer will do. There's really no advantage to paying a premium for Motorcraft. Just be aware that each wheel sensor is physically different, so be sure to order the wheel sensor for its specific location. Now I'll go ahead and install it, and again I'll put some anti-seize on it first. Yeah, I'm using copper this time, even though Ford specs out nickel, 'cause I'm just a rebel. Besides, no matter what Ford says, copper's better than nickel. Now that it's in its bore, I'll bolt it in. And when I did the other side, I forgot to mention that the mounting bolt has a special kind of head. It's an E-Torx, external Torx, which is basically a 6-point star. But you don't need an E-Torx socket. Since it has 6 points, you can use either a 6 or 12-point socket of the correct size, which in this case is 1/4 inch. I'll put some Loctite on it, thread it in by hand, and torque it down to 62 inch-pounds. And unlike the other side, I'm not done installing this ABS sensor. I still have to remove the old wiring harness and install the new wiring harness. It's held on by 2 clips on the underside of the car, and I'll just remove it from the first one with a screwdriver and replace it with the new one as I go. I'll add some silicone grease to the grommet to make it slide in the bracket easier, and then press the wiring harness grommet into the bracket. Now there doesn't seem to be too much slack between this first bracket and the sensor. It looks like this bracket's a little bent, so I'll straighten it out and that'll give me more slack. That's better. Seems good now. Now we're at the next clip, and I think it would be easier to remove the harness if I unscrewed it. It's just a sheet metal screw. Comes off easy enough with an 8mm socket and 1/4" ratchet. Now I can access the grommet easier and pry it out with a screwdriver. And before I go any further, I'll install the clip on the new harness. I'll just double check the orientation and put it on the same way. But I won't bolt it back in until I get the old harness removed. Now at this point the harness passes through the floor pan, and now you can see the grommet, which has to be removed. Although I suppose you could remove it from the underside, it's a lot easier to remove from the top. So I'll just leave the screwdriver there and go inside the car. Alright, I'm inside the car now, and I have to remove the seat bench to get to the floor pan where the harness comes through. And it's held in by 2 hidden spring-loaded latches, which you need to release. Then you can remove the seat. Then lift up the underlayment to expose the wiring harness. And you can see my screwdriver sticking through there. It's definitely easy to remove the grommet from this side. You can just do it with your fingers. Just push in and push it down. There you go. Grommet's removed. And then you have to disconnect the wire loom and the connector over here. And as you can see, the wire loom was never inserted in its mounting hole at the factory. No big deal. Maybe it was a Friday. Hey, one less thing for me to disconnect. So all I got to do is unplug the plug by pushing in on this tab and drop the wiring harness through the hole. Now I'm back underneath the car. I'll grab this old wiring harness and push it through this other hole here. Okay, the old wiring harness is removed. Now I can go back to running the new harness and push it through this hole. And the grommet has to be pushed through as well. And I already inserted the wiring harness into the bracket, so all I have to do is screw the bracket back on. Alright, the bracket's back in. Now I have to feed the harness up through the floor and press in the grommet. You can't really see what I'm doing, neither can I, because my hand's in the way. I'm just doing it by feel. And there you go, the grommet's in, more or less. When I go back to the inside of the car, I'll make sure it's seated properly. There's the grommet, and it's only halfway in its groove. So I'll just take a screwdriver and work the groove in all the way around. Alright, that's better. Now the grommet's seated properly. And now all that's left is the connector. Let me relocate the camera. First I'll put some dielectric on it. It's a little overkill because it never gets wet in here, but it can't hurt. Now I can plug the connector in. Push it in until it clicks. There you go, you know you're in. And then, even though Ford didn't bother, I'll push the wire loom into its mounting hole. And there you go, the new sensor's installed. Better than Ford, because that's the way I roll. And to finish up, I'll put the underlayment back down. Maybe I should vacuum this out too. Another day. No one's going to see it after I put the seat back down. And the seat goes back in even easier than it came out. Just feed the seat belts through, get it in position, and push it down to snap it in. Alright, now that the seat's back in, everything related to the installation of a new ABS sensor is done. Alright, so now I've removed and reinstalled both ABS sensors, and both were frozen in their bores by rust. One I removed the quick way, by busting it out. The other one took about 10 minutes longer to remove, because I made up a spanner bracket and pressed it out with C-clamps, so I can remove it without damage. As it turns out, even though it took longer to remove it by making up a spanner bracket and pressing it out with C-clamps, I saved time in the long run. Because by removing the sensor intact, all I had to do to reinstall it was bolt it back in its bore. And in order to replace the one that I destroyed in the removal process, I had to remove and reinstall the rear seat bench so I could remove the old wiring harness and install the new one. Not a big deal, but it took a little over 15 minutes. Not to mention the fact that I had to order a new sensor, spend $25, and wait 3 days for it to arrive. All to replace a sensor that was perfectly fine, but got destroyed because I got impatient when removing it. Now you've seen it done both ways, so you can make your own call on what way would be best for you.